My name is Ibrahim Traoré. Before I speak about faith, poverty, war, or the suffering of humanity, I want to say something honestly. I am not a pastor. I am not a prophet. I do not claim to be a saint. I am only a soldier from Burkina Faso, a man who grew up watching ordinary people suffer while powerful nations and powerful leaders spoke beautiful words about peace, justice, democracy, and civilization. For many years, I traveled across villages where children slept hungry beside land rich with gold and uranium. I met mothers who buried their sons because of armed conflict. I met fathers who worked every day yet could never escape poverty. I met young people who believed their only hope was to flee Africa and risk death across the desert or the sea. And during all those years, one question stayed inside my heart. Where is Jesus in a world full of war and poverty? That question became even deeper in March of the year 2024 during a visit near Kaya in central Burkina Faso. There I met an elderly Christian woman named Mariam Ouedraogo. She was 74 years old and lived alone in a small mud house beside an old wooden cross worn down by time and weather. She told me her husband had died during armed violence many years earlier. Her 2 sons were killed while trying to protect villagers from terrorist attacks. Her youngest daughter disappeared while trying to escape toward North Africa in search of work. I expected anger. I expected bitterness. I expected her to curse life itself. But instead, she looked at me peacefully and said something I will never forget. Human beings bring war into the world. God did not create evil. He created people with the freedom to choose. That moment changed me deeply. Since that day, I have wanted to speak not as a politician, but simply as a human being searching for truth in a wounded world. After meeting Mariam Ouedraogo near Kaya, I spent many nights thinking about her words. I had seen war with my own eyes. I had seen villages burned. I had seen children carrying fear in their eyes before they were even old enough to understand the meaning of politics or power. I had seen hunger in places where the ground beneath the soil contained resources worth billions of dollars. And yet that elderly woman who had lost almost everything still believed that God was not the author of evil. At first, I struggled with that idea, because when people witness enough suffering, they begin asking difficult questions. Some begin to lose faith completely. Some become angry at God. Others believe heaven has abandoned the earth. I understand those feelings because I have spoken with many people who carry such pain inside them. In some villages of Burkina Faso, I met parents who buried children after terrorist attacks. I met young men who lost their legs in explosions. I met women who walked for hours searching for water while foreign companies continued extracting wealth from African land. When people see such suffering every day, they naturally ask, if God exists, why does he allow this? I asked myself the same question many times. Then one evening, after returning from that village near Kaya, I opened the Bible and read the book of Genesis carefully. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, the scripture says, God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Those words stayed in my mind for a long time. Because if creation was originally good, then something else happened later. War was not created by God. Starvation was not created by God. Exploitation was not created by God. Human beings created those things. God created fertile land. Human greed turned land into battlefields. God created rivers and rain. Human corruption allowed millions to die thirsty. God created natural resources so nations could live with dignity. Human greed transformed those resources into reasons for invasion, exploitation, and endless conflict. The more I traveled across Africa, the more I realized something painful. Many people blame God for tragedies actually caused by human decisions. A child starving in a rich world is not proof that God abandoned humanity. It is proof that humanity abandoned its conscience. That truth may sound difficult, but I believe it must be spoken honestly. Today, the world produces enough food to feed billions of people, yet millions still go hungry. Entire nations possess oil, gold, diamonds, uranium, cobalt, and fertile land, yet ordinary citizens remain poor generation after generation. Can we truly blame God for that? Or should we look at the systems built by human beings themselves? I remember visiting communities where families survived on almost nothing while trucks carrying valuable resources left their regions every single day. I remember looking into the eyes of young boys who had never touched the wealth extracted from their own homeland. In those moments, I understood something deeply. The problem is not that God created a cruel world. The problem is that human beings often choose greed over compassion. And this truth is not only about Africa. I have spoken with people from the United States, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Many ordinary families everywhere feel abandoned. Many workers struggle while a small number of powerful individuals continue becoming richer than entire nations. Some people work all their lives and still cannot afford health care. Some elderly people feel forgotten after decades of labor. Some young people grow up believing life has no purpose beyond survival. This pain exists across the world. That is why the question about Jesus matters so much. Because many people no longer ask whether religion exists. They ask whether goodness itself still exists. And I believe the answer depends on humanity more than many are willing to admit. God gave human beings intelligence, freedom, and moral responsibility. But freedom also means people can choose selfishness, they can choose violence, they can choose domination. History proves this repeatedly. Entire wars were started because leaders desired more land, more resources, or more power. Millions died because of ambitions created by human pride. Yet afterward, people often ask, where was God? Perhaps the harder question is, where was humanity? Where was human conscience? Where was compassion? When children cry from hunger while enormous wealth exists nearby, that is not evidence of God's failure, it is evidence of human failure. I say this not with hatred, but with sadness. Because I believe many people have lost the ability to see one another as human beings. Modern society often teaches competition without mercy, wealth without responsibility, power without morality. And when societies worship money more than human dignity, suffering always follows. I have seen nations spend billions on weapons while villages lack schools and hospitals. I have seen leaders speak publicly about peace while secretly benefiting from instability. Again, these are human choices, not divine commands. Jesus never taught people to exploit the weak. He never taught nations to destroy one another for profit. He never taught leaders to enrich themselves while children starved. In fact, when I read the teachings of Christ, I see the opposite. I see a man who stood beside the poor. I see a man who defended the rejected. I see a man who warned humanity about greed. That is why I believe many people misunderstand faith itself. Faith does not mean pretending suffering does not exist. Faith means refusing to become cruel in response to suffering. That elderly woman near Kaya understood this better than many wealthy and educated people. She had every reason to hate the world, yet she continued praying, she continued believing in goodness, she continued refusing bitterness. Why? Because she understood something powerful. Evil is real, but human beings still have the choice to resist it. That may be the greatest freedom God ever gave humanity. The freedom to choose compassion instead of cruelty. The freedom to choose truth instead of manipulation. The freedom to choose love instead of hatred. Sadly, many people choose the opposite. And the consequences of those choices shape entire nations. Sometimes I think modern civilization has become spiritually exhausted. People have more technology than ever before, yet many feel emptier than ever before. Communication is instant, yet loneliness continues growing. Wealth increases, yet peace disappears. Why? Because material progress without moral responsibility creates imbalance. A society cannot survive only on money. It also needs conscience. It needs empathy. It needs truth. And this is where I believe many people still misunderstand Jesus. Some imagine faith as rituals, speeches, or public appearances inside churches, but the deeper message of Christ was about how human beings treat one another every day. If a man prays loudly but exploits the poor, what is the value of his prayer? If a leader speaks about God while stealing from his own people, does he truly follow God? If nations speak about human rights while destroying weaker countries economically or militarily, can they honestly claim moral superiority? These questions matter because hypocrisy destroys trust. Many young people today reject religion not because they hate God, but because they see too many people using religion dishonestly. That is dangerous. Because once people lose faith in goodness itself, society begins collapsing spiritually from within. I do not claim to possess all answers. I am only sharing what life has taught me through pain, war, leadership, and encounters with ordinary people. And one lesson has become clear to me. God did not create humanity to destroy itself. Human beings are doing that through greed, corruption, hatred, and indifference. But if humans created many of these problems, then humans can also choose differently. That means hope still exists. Hope exists whenever a person refuses corruption. Hope exists whenever someone feeds the hungry. Hope exists whenever a leader tells the truth despite pressure. Hope exists whenever ordinary people protect one another during difficult times. And perhaps that is where Jesus still lives in this wounded world. Not inside systems of greed, not inside violence, but inside every act of compassion that survives despite darkness. That is what I slowly began understanding after meeting Mariam Ouedraogo. And it changed the way I see both faith and leadership forever. As I continued reflecting on the question of suffering, another truth became impossible for me to ignore. Africa is not poor because God cursed Africa. That sentence may sound simple, but it carries enormous weight. For generations, many people around the world have looked at Africa only through images of famine, war, disease, or instability. Entire Pom Frim Fria. and free it nations described as hopeless places needing endless rescue from outside powers. But when I traveled across my own continent and studied its reality carefully, I understood something very different. Africa is one of the richest regions on Earth. The continent possesses vast reserves of gold, diamonds, oil, uranium, cobalt, copper, lithium, fertile farmland, forests, rivers, and human potential. According to international economic reports, Africa holds a massive percentage of the world's mineral resources. Some of the materials powering modern industries, smartphones, batteries, vehicles, and advanced technology come directly from African soil. Yet millions of African families still struggle to survive. How can a land so rich contain so much poverty? That contradiction haunted me for years. I remember standing in villages of Burkina Faso where people lacked electricity while uranium from African land helped power cities thousands of kilometers away. I remember meeting children who studied under broken roofs while enormous wealth left the continent daily through international extraction systems. In those moments, I realized something painful. This situation cannot honestly be called the will of God. No loving creator would design a world where children starve beside mountains of wealth. Human systems created this imbalance. Human greed maintained it. Human indifference allowed it to continue. Many outsiders do not fully understand how deep these problems go. Colonialism officially ended decades ago in many African countries, but economic dependence often remained, political pressure remained, financial control remained, foreign military influence remained, resource exploitation remained. The methods changed, but the imbalance often continued. I say this carefully because I do not believe all people from Western nations are evil. I have met compassionate Americans, Europeans, and people from many countries who sincerely care about justice and human dignity. This is not about hatred between races or nations. It is about systems. It is about truth. For many decades, powerful international interests benefited enormously from African weakness. Weak governments made exploitation easier. Poverty made cheap labor easier. Instability made foreign influence easier. And ordinary African citizens paid the price. Some children lost education. Some communities lost healthcare. Some nations lost sovereignty over their own resources. Meanwhile, the world often blamed Africans themselves for the resulting poverty. That injustice must be spoken openly. Because when people hear only one side of history, they begin believing false narratives. I have heard people say Africans are poor because they do not work hard enough. That is deeply untrue. African farmers wake before sunrise. African mothers sacrifice endlessly for their children. African workers labor in difficult conditions every day. African communities survive hardships many wealthy societies could barely imagine. The issue is larger than effort. The issue is that generations of extraction weakened entire systems across the continent. And still, despite everything, many African people continue surviving with remarkable dignity and faith. That is something the world rarely discusses enough. I have seen poor families share food with neighbors even when they themselves had almost nothing. I have seen communities protect one another during terrorism and displacement. I have seen people continue praying despite unimaginable pain. Sometimes the richest humanity exists among people with the fewest possessions. And that truth should humble the modern world. Because many wealthy societies today possess abundance, but suffer spiritual emptiness. Meanwhile, some of the poorest communities still preserve compassion, family values, and human connection. This does not mean poverty is beautiful. Poverty destroys opportunities, it shortens lives, it creates suffering that no human being should romanticize. I do not want Africans to remain poor while the rest of the world praises their resilience. No, I want African children to have schools. I want villages to have hospitals. I want farmers to control the value of their labor. I want African nations to process their own resources instead of exporting raw wealth while importing finished products at higher prices. Most importantly, I want African people to live with dignity, because dignity matters as much as economics. One of the greatest wounds created by exploitation is psychological. Many generations were taught to see themselves as inferior, dependent, or incapable. Colonial systems often attack not only economies but also confidence and identity. That damage can continue long after official independence. This is why leadership matters deeply. A nation without self-respect becomes vulnerable to manipulation. And this is also why faith matters. Because true faith reminds human beings that every person carries value before God. No child is born inferior. No race is created to dominate another. No continent was designed to remain permanently weak while others prosper forever. When I read the teachings of Jesus, I do not see support for exploitation. I see compassion. I see justice. I see warnings against greed. In many churches across Christ also speaks. How can people claim to follow Jesus while benefiting from systems that crush entire populations? How can leaders pray publicly while ignoring suffering created by greed and exploitation? These questions disturb many people today, and honestly they should, because faith without moral courage becomes empty performance. Sometimes I think the world has become comfortable with inequality because it has existed for so long. Entire generations grow up seeing poverty and eventually begin accepting it as normal. But suffering should never become normal. Children dying from hunger in a wealthy world is not normal. Communities sitting on valuable resources while remaining poor is not normal. Entire nations trapped in debt while multinational corporations grow richer is not normal. These are human choices disguised as inevitability. And once people recognize that truth, responsibility becomes unavoidable. I know some people become uncomfortable when African leaders speak openly about these realities. Some prefer silence, some prefer polite speeches that avoid difficult historical truths. But silence does not heal injustice. Truth is necessary for healing. At the same time, I also believe Africans themselves must take responsibility for the future. We cannot blame outsiders forever while ignoring corruption within our own nations. Some African leaders betrayed their own people for personal gain. Some accepted systems that enriched a few while ordinary citizens suffered. That reality must also be confronted honestly. Real change requires integrity both internally and externally. It requires courage. It requires leaders willing to serve instead of dominate. And it requires ordinary citizens refusing hopelessness. Because hopeless people are easier to control. That may be one of the greatest dangers facing humanity today. When people lose hope, they stop believing change is possible. They stop believing truth matters. They stop believing goodness can survive. But I refuse to accept that future. I believe Africa can rise with dignity. Not through hatred, not through revenge, but through sovereignty, truth, education, unity, and moral courage. And I believe the teachings of Jesus support human dignity far more than many political systems ever have. Jesus stood beside the poor. He defended the marginalized. He challenged hypocrisy. He warned against worshiping wealth. Those lessons remain relevant today because greed still controls too much of the modern world. Sometimes people ask me whether I believe God has abandoned Africa. My answer is no. I believe humanity abandoned its moral responsibilities toward Africa. But abandonment by people is not the same as abandonment by God. In fact, I often think God continues revealing himself through the resilience of ordinary African people, through mothers who continue loving despite hardship, through fathers who continue working despite poverty, through communities that continue sharing despite scarcity. That strength is real, and it deserves respect from the world. The future of Africa should not be endless dependence. It should be dignity. It should be partnership instead of exploitation. It should be development without humiliation. And above all, it should be guided by the understanding that every human life possesses equal value before God. That is what I increasingly began understanding after my journey through villages, refugee camps, and forgotten communities. Poverty in Africa is not proof that God failed. It is proof that humanity still has much to answer for. As I grew older and began studying the history of Africa more deeply, I realized something many ordinary people around the world were never fully taught. The suffering of Africa did not happen by accident. Many powerful nations came to Africa speaking about civilization, progress, religion, and development. But behind many of those promises stood another reality: extraction, control, profit. I speak about this carefully because history is painful, and pain can easily become hatred if people are not wise. I do not want young Africans to hate ordinary Europeans or Americans. Hatred only creates new cycles of destruction. But truth must still be spoken honestly. For many years, Burkina Faso lived under French colonial rule. During that period, African labor, African land, and African resources helped enrich foreign powers, while many local populations remained poor and politically powerless. And Burkina Faso was not alone. Across the continent, borders were drawn by outsiders, resources were taken by outsiders, economies were structured to serve external interests. Entire generations were taught that African cultures, languages, and identities were somehow inferior. That kind of psychological damage lasts longer than many people realize. Even after formal independence arrived, many African nations remained economically tied to systems they did not fully control. Currency systems remained connected to foreign influence. Military arrangements remained unequal. International companies continued extracting enormous wealth, while ordinary citizens often saw little benefit. Some people dislike hearing this because it challenges comforting narratives, but the reality is visible. Why do some of the world's richest resource regions remain among the poorest populations? Why do foreign corporations become wealthy from African minerals while villages near extraction zones often lack clean water, schools, or hospitals? Why do some countries remain dependent generation after generation despite enormous natural wealth? These are not imaginary questions. They are real, and millions of Africans live with the consequences every day. I remember speaking with workers near mining regions who told me they watched trucks leave filled with wealth while their own families struggled to buy food. I remember mothers asking why their children had no future despite the riches beneath their homeland. Those conversations stayed inside me. Because once you truly listen to ordinary people, it becomes impossible to ignore the injustice surrounding them. Sometimes the world discusses Africa as though instability appeared naturally, as though poverty simply emerged from nowhere. But history matters, systems matter. Exploitation over many generations creates wounds that do not disappear quickly. Imagine a nation whose wealth continuously leaves while dependency remains. Imagine generations growing up under structures designed primarily for extraction rather than local development. Imagine leaders pressured politically and economically whenever they attempt independent paths. This is part of Africa's story, not the entire story. But en important pas. At the same time, I must also speak honestly about another painful truth. Some African leaders help maintain these systems. That is one of the deepest tragedies of all. Certain leaders chose personal luxury over national dignity. Some protected foreign interests while ordinary citizens suffered. Others used fear, corruption, or division to remain in power while their nations weakened. This betrayal wounded Africa deeply, because external exploitation becomes even stronger when internal leadership lacks integrity. That is why I believe true leadership must begin with moral responsibility. A leader should not exist to become rich while citizens become poorer. A leader should not speak proudly about patriotism while secretly selling national dignity for personal gain. A leader should not pray publicly while privately participating in corruption. Unfortunately, this hypocrisy exists in many parts of the world, not only Africa. And ordinary people everywhere are becoming tired of it. They are tired of speeches without honesty, tired of promises without justice, tired of systems where the powerful grow stronger while ordinary families struggle more every year. This frustration is global now. Many people in the United States feel abandoned by elites. Many Europeans feel uncertain about the future. Many Africans feel trapped between foreign influence and local corruption. Despite different cultures and nations, ordinary people often carry similar pain. That is why I believe humanity must stop dividing itself so easily. Powerful systems benefit when ordinary people blame one another instead of questioning injustice itself. An African farmer and an American worker may live very different lives, but both can suffer when greed dominates economic systems. Both can feel powerless, both can feel ignored, and both deserve dignity. When I read about Jesus, I notice something important. He constantly challenged hypocrisy. He challenged people who appeared righteous publicly while exploiting others privately. He warned against religious performance without compassion. He criticized those who love power more than truth. Those teachings matter greatly today, because modern society often rewards appearances more than integrity. A leader can deliver beautiful speeches while citizens continue suffering. A corporation can speak about ethics while exploiting workers. A nation can speak about freedom while benefiting from global inequality. This contradiction damages trust everywhere. And when trust disappears, fear and division grow rapidly. Sometimes I think the world has become addicted to power itself. Nations compete endlessly, companies compete endlessly, political groups compete endlessly. Everyone wants dominance, but very few ask whether humanity is becoming wiser. Technology grows, weapons grow, profits grow, yet compassion often shrinks. That imbalance is dangerous. I remember one conversation with an elderly man in Burkina Faso who told me something simple but powerful. He said, "When powerful people stop seeing poor people as human beings, suffering becomes easy to justify." Those words stayed with me. Because many systems today treat people as numbers instead of human souls. Workers become statistics. Refugees become political arguments. Poor communities become invisible. And once people become invisible, exploitation becomes easier. This is why truth matters so much. Not to create hatred, but to restore human dignity. I do not believe the future should be built on revenge against former colonial powers. Revenge only creates new destruction. But neither should history be hidden. Healing requires honesty. Real partnership between nations requires honesty. Respect requires honesty. Africa does not need pity. Africa needs fairness. Africa needs sovereignty. Africa needs the ability to develop according to the interests of its own people, instead of remaining trapped in dependency. And this is not only about economics, it is also spiritual. Because systems of exploitation damage the human soul. They teach people to normalize inequality. They encourage societies to value profit more than conscience. That is why the teachings of Christ remain relevant. Jesus did not teach domination. He taught service. He did not teach exploitation. He taught compassion. He did not teach greed. He warned against it repeatedly. Sometimes people ask why faith still matters in discussions about politics, economics, or leadership. My answer is simple. Because without morality, power becomes dangerous. Without conscience, intelligence becomes destructive. Without compassion, systems eventually crush human beings. History proves this again and again. Empires rise believing themselves permanent. Powerful systems appear invincible. Wealth accumulates in enormous quantities. But eventually, corruption weakens everything built without justice. That is why I believe moral truth matters more than temporary power. One day, every empire fades. Every government changes. Every corporation disappears. But human dignity remains sacred. And perhaps that is one lesson humanity still struggles to learn. The world cannot continue worshiping greed while expecting peace. It cannot continue exploiting weaker populations while expecting stability. It cannot continue praising morality publicly while rewarding corruption privately. Eventually, the consequences always arrive. I say these things not because I hate the world, but because I want something better for it. I want African children to grow up believing their lives matter. I want nations to cooperate without exploitation. I want leaders to understand that power is responsibility, not ownership. And I want ordinary people everywhere to remember something important. No system lasts forever. Only truth endures. That realization became stronger inside me every time I visited forgotten communities, every time I listened to grieving families, and every time I saw ordinary people preserving kindness despite enormous hardship. Because even in the middle of exploitation and injustice, humanity still carries the ability to choose another path. And perhaps that choice is where real hope begins. The more I read the Bible after meeting that elderly woman near Kaya, the more I realize something many people overlook. Jesus was never close to the powerful elites of his time. He walked among ordinary people. He spoke with fishermen, workers, widows, the sick, the rejected, and the forgotten. He spent time with those society often ignored. He defended people who were judged harshly by others. He comforted the suffering instead of flattering the powerful. That truth changed the way I understood faith completely. Because many people today imagine religion as something connected mainly to authority, wealth, large buildings, or public appearances. But when I read the words of Christ carefully, I see humility more than status. Jesus himself was born in poverty. He did not enter the world surrounded by luxury. He understood struggle. He understood rejection. He understood suffering. And perhaps that is why millions of poor people across the world still feel connected to him even in the middle of pain. I remember visiting displaced families in Burkina Faso after terrorist violence forced them to flee their homes. Some had lost nearly everything. Some children no longer attended school. Some parents had no certainty about the future. Yet many still prayed together at night. Some outsiders may not understand that. They may ask how people can continue believing after experiencing such suffering. But I think faith often becomes strongest when human beings have nothing else left to hold on to. That does not mean suffering is good. It means hope becomes necessary for survival. One evening, while speaking with a displaced mother holding her young child, she told me something I still remember clearly. She said, "When people forget us, God still sees us." That sentence stayed with me because it revealed something important. Many poor people do not believe Jesus abandoned them. Instead, they believe the world abandoned them. And honestly, there is truth in that feeling. Too often, powerful societies become comfortable ignoring suffering as long as it remains far away. Wars become headlines instead of human tragedies. Hunger becomes statistics instead of real children. Entire populations become invisible unless their pain affects global markets or political interests. But according to the teachings of Christ, no human being is invisible. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 40, Jesus says, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Those words are powerful because they mean compassion toward the vulnerable is not optional. It is central. When a hungry child is ignored, humanity fails morally. When refugees are treated like burdens instead of human beings, humanity fails morally. When leaders enrich themselves while citizens suffer, humanity fails morally. Jesus spoke repeatedly about this kind of responsibility. Values. Greed becomes admired. Wealth becomes worshipped. Power becomes more important than kindness. Sometimes I think humanity has become spiritually confused. Many people publicly praise morality while privately rewarding selfishness. Some leaders speak constantly about God while exploiting the weak behind closed doors. That contradiction pushes many people away from faith itself, because hypocrisy destroys trust. I understand why some young people become cynical when they see religious language used for political gain. They hear speeches about morality while corruption continues. They hear prayers while injustice grows. Eventually they begin believing faith itself is dishonest. But I do not believe Jesus should be judged by the hypocrisy of people who misuse his name. That distinction matters deeply. Human beings fail constantly. That does not erase truth itself. When I study the life of Christ, I do not see a man obsessed with wealth or domination. I see someone who warned humanity repeatedly about greed and hardness of heart. He said it is difficult for those attached to riches to enter the kingdom of God. Why? Because greed slowly weakens compassion. A person consumed entirely by profit can eventually stop seeing other people as human beings. And once that happens, exploitation becomes easier to justify. I believe this is one reason the modern world struggles so much today. Many systems are organized around profit first and humanity second. Healthcare becomes business. Food becomes business. Education becomes business. Even war sometimes becomes business. And whenever profit becomes more important than human dignity, suffering increases. That reality exists across continents. In Africa, resources are extracted while many communities remain poor. In America, some families work constantly yet still cannot afford basic medical care or stable housing. In many parts of the world, ordinary people feel exhausted while a small number accumulate unimaginable wealth. This imbalance creates spiritual emptiness as well as economic pain. Because human beings were not created merely to survive financially, they also need meaning. They need dignity. They need compassion. And that is where I believe the message of Jesus still speaks powerfully today. Not because religion magically removes suffering, but because Christ constantly reminded humanity to protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. I sometimes think people misunderstand strength itself. Modern society often defines strength as dominance, wealth, or influence. But Jesus showed another kind of strength. The strength to forgive. The strength to remain compassionate in a cruel world. The strength to tell the truth despite pressure. The strength to stand beside rejected people when society abandons them. That kind of strength is rare today. And perhaps that is why the world feels increasingly cold. I remember once visiting a small church in a rural part of Burkina Faso. The building was extremely simple. The roof leaked during rain. The benches were old. The community itself was poor. Yet during prayer, I noticed something remarkable. People genuinely cared for one another. After the service, families shared food together even though they possessed very little. Elderly women comforted children whose fathers had died in conflict. Young men helped repair damaged homes without asking for payment. Watching them, I realized something important. Compassion still exists strongly among ordinary people. Sometimes more strongly than among the wealthy and powerful. That church had almost no material riches, but spiritually it felt alive. Meanwhile, some of the richest places in the world feel emotionally empty despite enormous luxury. That contrast taught me an important lesson. Human dignity cannot be measured only through money. A society may become wealthy yet spiritually lost. Another society may struggle economically yet preserve humanity and compassion. Of course, I do not want Africans to remain poor in order to appear spiritually pure. Poverty destroys opportunities and creates suffering. But I also believe the modern world desperately needs moral balance. Technology alone cannot save humanity. Military power cannot save humanity. Economic growth alone cannot save humanity. Without compassion, civilizations eventually damage themselves from within. That is why I believe the teachings of Christ remain relevant beyond religion itself. Because they remind people that human beings are more important than systems, more important than profit, more important than political ambition. Sometimes people ask me where Jesus is in the middle of wars, displacement, and poverty. I no longer think the answer is found mainly in speeches or institutions. I think Jesus is present wherever compassion survives. In the mother protecting her children despite fear, in the stranger sharing food during hardship, in communities refusing hatred after violence, in people who continue choosing kindness even when the world rewards selfishness. That elderly woman near Kaya understood this deeply. She had lost her husband. She had lost her sons. She had lost her daughter, yet she still refused bitterness. Why? Because she believed evil should not be allowed to destroy the human heart completely. That realization affected me profoundly, because true faith may not be about escaping suffering. Perhaps it is about refusing to let suffering transform us into cruel people ourselves. And honestly, that may be one of the hardest challenges facing humanity today. The world is full of anger, full of division, full of fear. Many people are tempted to respond to pain with hatred, but hatred only multiplies darkness. Jesus understood this. That is why he constantly spoke about mercy, forgiveness, humility, and love for others. Not because these ideas are weak, but because they are necessary for civilization itself to survive. Without them, societies eventually collapse morally, no matter how advanced they become technologically. And that is something I believe both Africa and the world must remember moving forward. Because no nation can build a just future while forgetting the humanity of its people. And no leader can truly serve God while ignoring the suffering of the weak. Many people across the world ask the same question whenever they see destruction. If God exists, why are there still wars? I understand that question very well. I have seen too much suffering not to understand it. I have spoken with soldiers carrying emotional wounds they could not describe. I have met children terrified by the sound of gunfire. I have walked through communities where entire families disappeared because violence entered their villages overnight. War leaves scars that remain long after weapons fall silent. And when people witness enough pain, they naturally search for someone to blame. Some blame governments. Some blame religion. Some blame history. And many blame God. But over time, I came to believe something very strongly. Most wars begin long before the first bullet is fired. They begin inside the human heart. They begin when greed becomes stronger than conscience. When power becomes more important than compassion. When leaders value domination more than human life. That is where war truly starts. Not on battlefields. Inside human ambition. The Bible never teaches people to invade weaker nations for profit. Jesus never instructed humanity to exploit others in order to become wealthy. He never taught that some human lives matter less than others. Yet throughout history, wars repeatedly emerged because powerful groups wanted more land, more influence, more resources, or more control. Millions of innocent people paid the price for desires created by a small number of individuals. This truth is difficult, but necessary. Human beings often create the suffering they later blame on God. I remember speaking with displaced families in Burkina Faso who had lost everything because armed violence entered their communities. Some no longer had homes. Some had no schools for their children. Some had lost relatives whose bodies they never even recovered. When I listened to them, I noticed something heartbreaking. Ordinary people rarely want war. It is usually ordinary people who suffer most from it. The rich often remain protected. The powerful often remain distant. But poor families lose sons, daughters, homes, futures, and peace. That reality exists across the world. Whether in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, or elsewhere, ordinary citizens usually carry the heaviest burden of conflict. And still, humanity continues repeating the same mistakes generation after generation. Why? Because greed is powerful. Fear is powerful. The desire for domination is powerful. Sometimes people imagine evil as something mysterious or supernatural, but many forms of evil are painfully ordinary. They appear whenever people stop valuing human life equally. A businessman willing to profit from war, a politician willing to spread hatred for votes, a leader willing to sacrifice innocent lives for power. These choices create destruction long before violence officially begins. That is why I believe moral responsibility matters so much. Without conscience, intelligence becomes dangerous. Without compassion, power becomes destructive. Without truth, societies become vulnerable to manipulation. I think modern civilization often underestimates how dangerous greed truly is. Many people see greed as merely a personal flaw, but history shows it can destroy entire nations. How many wars began because leaders desired resources? How many conflicts were prolonged because instability remained profitable for someone? How many innocent lives were sacrificed because human beings refused moderation? When I study history carefully, I see the same pattern repeatedly. Power without morality eventually produces suffering. And sadly, modern society often rewards exactly that kind of behavior. Aggression becomes admired. Exploitation becomes normalized. Wealth accumulation becomes the highest goal regardless of consequences. Meanwhile, compassion is treated as weakness. Humility is treated as foolishness. Mercy is treated as naive. But Jesus taught something entirely different. He warned humanity repeatedly about the danger of worshiping wealth and power. He understood how greed could slowly corrupt the soul. He understood how pride could blind people morally. That wisdom remains relevant because the human heart has not changed very much across history. Technology changes. Weapons change. Empire change. But greed remains remarkably similar. Sometimes I think humanity has learned how to advance scientifically much faster than morally. People can communicate instantly across continents, yet nations still struggle to live peacefully together. The world possesses enormous resources, yet millions remain hungry. Humanity has incredible technological ability, yet emotional emptiness and violence continue spreading. Why? Because external progress alone cannot heal internal corruption. A civilization may become powerful while remaining spiritually immature. And when spiritual maturity disappears, conflict becomes easier. I once spoke with an elderly religious man who told me something simple but profound. He said, "Every war begins when people stop seeing each other as human beings." Those words stayed with me, because hatred often requires dehumanization first. Before violence becomes acceptable, people convince themselves that others matter less. Different races, religions, nations, or political groups become portrayed as enemies instead of fellow human beings. Once that happens, cruelty becomes easier to justify. History proves this repeatedly. And this is why the teachings of Jesus remain important far beyond church walls. Because Christ constantly reminded people to love others, show mercy, forgive, and protect the weak. Those teachings are not merely religious ideals, they are necessary foundations for civilization itself. Without them, societies eventually become consumed by division and fear. I know some people hear words like love and forgiveness and think they sound unrealistic in today's world. They say modern politics requires hardness, aggression, and domination. But look honestly at the condition of humanity today. Has endless competition brought peace? Has greed created happiness? Has hatred created stability? In many places, the answer is clearly no. The world grows richer materially while becoming more anxious emotionally. Many people feel exhausted spiritually. And one reason is that societies increasingly encourage selfishness instead of shared responsibility. When money becomes the highest value, human beings slowly become secondary. Then war becomes easier. Exploitation becomes easier. Corruption becomes easier. That is why I believe leaders carry enormous moral responsibility. A leader's words can calm nations or divide them. A leader's choices can preserve life or destroy it. A leader who encourages hatred for personal gain is deeply dangerous. And sadly, history has produced many such leaders. Sometimes religion itself has even been manipulated to justify violence. This deeply troubles me because Jesus never taught people to use faith as a weapon for domination. True faith should humanize people, not make them crueler. Yet throughout history, some individuals used religious language while pursuing political or economic ambitions. This hypocrisy damages humanity greatly. Because when people see religion associated with violence or greed, many lose trust not only in institutions but also in spiritual truth itself. That is tragic. Because the real message of Christ opposed greed and oppression rather than supporting them. I think often about the young generation growing up today. Many children are surrounded constantly by images of conflict, anger, division, and fear. Some begin believing violence is simply normal human behavior. But I refuse to believe humanity was created only for conflict. Yes, human beings possess the ability to destroy, but they also possess the ability to protect, forgive, rebuild, and love. That freedom matters enormously. God did not create robots incapable of moral choice. Human beings were given freedom, and freedom includes responsibility. This is why I believe people cannot continue blaming God for every human decision. When leaders choose corruption, when corporations exploit suffering, when societies reward greed, these are human choices with human consequences. The responsibility belongs to us. At the same time, recognizing this truth also means hope still exists. Because if human choices created many of these problems, human choices can also help solve them. People can choose compassion. Leaders can choose honesty. Nations can choose cooperation instead of exploitation. Communities can choose reconciliation instead of revenge. These possibilities remain real. That is why I still believe humanity is not beyond redemption. I have seen too many ordinary people display courage and kindness during terrible circumstances to completely lose hope. I have seen strangers share food during displacement. I have seen families forgive after violence. I have seen communities rebuild after destruction. These moments remind me that darkness never completely destroys light. And perhaps that is where Jesus still speaks most clearly today. not through systems obsessed with domination, but through ordinary people who refuse to surrender their humanity even in painful times. That elderly woman near Kaya taught me this lesson without even realizing it. Despite losing almost everything, she still refused hatred. She still believed goodness mattered. She still believed human beings could choose differently. And honestly, that may be one of the greatest acts of courage possible in the modern world. Because maintaining compassion in a cruel society is not weakness. It is strength. Real strength. The kind of strength humanity desperately needs if it truly wants peace. As I continued traveling across Burkina Faso and speaking with ordinary people, I slowly realized something deeper than economics alone. Africa does not suffer only from lack of money. Africa also suffers from lack of dignity within the global system. This truth is important because many conversations about Africa are shaped entirely around charity, aid, or rescue. The continent is often presented to the world as though Africans exist only as victims waiting for stronger nations to save them. But African people are not children. They are human beings with intelligence, history, culture, strength, and dreams. And no human being can live fully without dignity. Of course, economic development matters greatly. I want schools built, I want hospitals improved, I want roads, agriculture, education, technology, and opportunity for the next generation. Poverty destroys too many futures, and I never romanticize suffering. But I also know something else. A nation can receive money and still remain psychologically dependent. A people can receive aid while losing confidence in themselves. That kind of hidden damage is extremely dangerous. Because once people stop believing in their own value, they become easier to control. I remember visiting schools where young African children spoke more confidently about foreign countries than about their own history. Some had unconsciously absorbed the idea that greatness belongs somewhere else, that innovation belongs somewhere else, that intelligence belonged somewhere else. This saddened me deeply. Not because other nations are enemies, but because every child deserves pride in their identity and potential. True development is not merely financial. It is also spiritual, psychological, and cultural. A child should grow up believing their life matters equally before God. An African child should never feel naturally inferior to a European child or an American child. Human dignity does not depend on geography. And this is one reason I believe the teachings of Jesus still matter profoundly. Because Christ treated human beings with dignity regardless of status. He spoke with the rejected. He touched the sick. He defended those society looked down upon. He reminded humanity that value is not determined by wealth or social position. Modern society often forgets this lesson. Today, many people are respected only when they possess money, influence, or power. Poor people become invisible. Entire nations become judged according to economic strength rather than human worth. That mentality is spiritually dangerous. Because once societies measure human value only through wealth, compassion weakens rapidly. I have seen this mentality affect Africa for generations. Some outsiders speak about Africa with pity, but not respect. Others discuss the continent only in terms of resources, strategic interests, or humanitarian crises. Very few truly ask what African people themselves want for their future. That imbalance must change. Africa does not need permanent dependency disguised as generosity. Africa needs partnership with dignity. It needs fair trade instead of exploitation. It needs education that empowers rather than humiliates. It needs leadership committed to serving citizens instead of enriching small elites. Most importantly, African people need to believe again in their own potential. Because hopeless populations become vulnerable populations. I often think about the younger generation. Many African youths today grow up connected to the internet, global media, and international culture. They see wealth displayed constantly on screens while their own communities struggle economically. Some begin believing success can exist only outside Africa. Others lose hope completely. This concerns me deeply, because a continent cannot rise if its own children stop believing in it. That is why dignity matters so much. A person with dignity can survive hardship while still preserving self-respect. But a person stripped of dignity begins feeling spiritually defeated even before life truly begins. I saw this clearly while speaking with farmers in rural Burkina Faso. Many worked extremely hard every day, yet international systems often determined the value of their labor unfairly. Some felt invisible despite feeding communities through difficult conditions. And yet when I listened carefully, I noticed something remarkable. Most did not ask for luxury. They asked for fairness, for opportunity, for respect, for the ability to live honorably through their own work. That desire is universal across humanity. People want dignity more than pity. Even in refugee camps, I noticed something important. Families displaced by violence still tried to preserve normal life. Mothers cleaned shelters carefully. Fathers attempted to organize small routines for children. Communities created prayer spaces and shared meals together. Why? Because dignity is connected to the human soul. People naturally seek meaning, order, and self-respect even during suffering. And this is why leadership matters profoundly. A leader should never humiliate their own people for foreign approval. A leader should never act as though citizens are worthless. A leader should inspire confidence, responsibility, and unity. Sadly, many political systems across the world operate through fear instead of dignity. Citizens are manipulated emotionally. Communities are divided against one another. Poverty is sometimes maintained because desperation makes control easier. This happens globally, not only in Africa. And the consequences are severe. People become cynical. They stop trusting institutions. They stop believing truth matters. They stop believing morality exists in public life. Eventually, societies become spiritually exhausted. I believe this exhaustion explains much of the anger visible across the world today. Many ordinary people feel disrespected, ignored, or economically trapped. Some feel reduced to statistics within systems controlled by distant elites. That frustration is real. And unless societies restore human dignity, division will continue growing. Jesus understood the importance of dignity deeply. When he healed people, he restored not only physical health but also human worth. When he defended the rejected, he restored social dignity. When he spoke with the poor, he reminded them they were not forgotten before God. That message still matters enormously today, because modern civilization often strips dignity away silently. Workers become disposable. Elderly people become burdens. Poor nations become markets. Human beings become economic units instead of souls. This mentality damages everyone eventually, including wealthy societies themselves. A world without dignity becomes emotionally cold. And once societies lose compassion, even prosperity begins feeling empty. That is why I believe Africa's future cannot be built only around economic statistics. Yes, development matters, but dignity matters equally. African children should learn science and technology while also respecting their own cultures and history. African nations should cooperate internationally while maintaining sovereignty and self-respect. African citizens should receive opportunities without feeling dependent on foreign approval for their humanity. This vision is not about isolation. It is about balance, mutual respect, shared humanity. I believe the world desperately needs this perspective now because too many systems reward domination rather than partnership. Powerful nations often expect weaker nations to obey instead of cooperate equally. But real peace cannot exist without dignity. A relationship built entirely on dependency eventually creates resentment. Only respect creates lasting stability. And respect begins by recognizing equal human value, not only in speeches, but in economic systems, in international relationships, in leadership decisions, in everyday treatment of ordinary people. Sometimes I think the greatest poverty in the modern world is not material poverty alone. It is moral poverty. The inability to recognize the humanity of others. That kind of poverty exists in rich countries and poor countries alike. And unless humanity confronts it honestly, technology and wealth alone will never bring peace. I learned this lesson slowly through conversations with farmers, displaced families, elderly women, teachers, workers, and children across Burkina Faso. Many possessed little materially, but some carried tremendous dignity. Meanwhile, I have also seen wealthy individuals with enormous resources who seem spiritually restless and emotionally empty. That contrast taught me something unforgettable. Money can improve comfort, but dignity gives meaning. And perhaps that is one reason Jesus spoke so often about humility, compassion, and the human heart rather than wealth itself. Because civilizations survive not only through power or economics, they survive through the way human beings value one another. That is the future I hope for Africa. Not simply survival, not endless dependence, but dignity. One of the things that pains me most in the modern world is not only corruption itself, it is hypocrisy, especially hypocrisy committed in the name of God. Over the years, I have seen leaders stand before cameras speaking about morality, faith, patriotism, and justice, while secretly betraying the very people they promised to protect. I have seen public prayers followed by private corruption. I have seen speeches about peace followed by actions that created suffering. I have seen religion used as decoration for political ambition. And honestly, this damages humanity deeply. Because when leaders misuse faith for personal power, ordinary people begin losing trust not only in politics but sometimes even in God himself. That is a dangerous tragedy. I remember once speaking with a young man displaced by violence in Burkina Faso. He told me something very direct. He said, "How can leaders talk about God while children sleep hungry?" His frustration was understandable. Many people feel this way today. They see leaders attend religious ceremonies while ordinary citizens continue suffering. They hear constant speeches about morality while corruption spreads quietly behind closed doors. Eventually, people begin wondering whether faith itself has become merely performance. But I believe true faith cannot be separated from behavior. A person may speak beautifully about God, but if they exploit the weak, steal public wealth, or manipulate human suffering for personal gain, their actions reveal the truth more clearly than their words. Jesus himself warned repeatedly about this kind of hypocrisy. When I read the Bible, I noticed that some of Christ's strongest criticisms were directed not toward ordinary sinners but toward religious hypocrisy. He challenged people who appeared righteous publicly while acting unjustly privately. Why? Because hypocrisy confuses society morally. It teaches people to distrust truth itself. And once societies lose trust completely, cynicism begins spreading everywhere. I think this is happening in many parts of the world today. People no longer believe leaders easily. They no longer trust institutions easily. Some no longer trust religion easily. And honestly, many leaders helped create this crisis through dishonesty and greed. Faith should inspire humility. But some people use religion to increase their authority. Faith should protect the vulnerable. But some people use religion to manipulate vulnerable populations emotionally. Faith should encourage compassion. But some people speak about God while living entirely for wealth and power. This contradiction wounds society spiritually. I remember visiting communities where ordinary families donated from their small income to churches because they sincerely believed in helping others. Some mothers sacrificed personal comfort to support religious communities. Some elderly people prayed every day for peace and justice. Meanwhile, certain wealthy leaders used religion publicly while living in enormous luxury, disconnected from the suffering surrounding them. That contrast disturbed me deeply, because ordinary believers are often sincere. But some powerful individuals transform faith into an image instead of a moral responsibility. And the consequences are serious. Young people begin believing morality is fake. Communities become divided. Religion becomes associated with manipulation instead of compassion. Eventually, many stop believing goodness exists in public life at all. This is why integrity matters so much. A true leader should fear betraying the trust of the people. A true leader should understand that power is temporary. A true leader should remember that every decision affects real human lives. Sadly, many leaders today appear more concerned with maintaining influence than serving humanity. Some speak about national unity while secretly benefiting from division. Some speak about justice while protecting corruption. Some speak about God while worshiping money. And this problem exists in many countries, not only Africa. In every continent, ordinary people are becoming tired of empty words disconnected from reality. They want honesty. They want accountability. They want leaders who genuinely care about human beings instead of treating citizens like tools for political survival. I believe this desire is deeply connected to spiritual hunger, because human beings naturally seek truth. Even people who struggle with religion often still hunger for sincerity, justice, and compassion. When those qualities disappear from leadership, societies become emotionally exhausted. And once emotional exhaustion spreads widely, anger and division become easier to manipulate politically. This is one reason I believe the teachings of Jesus remain so important. Christ constantly emphasized humility and service over status. He washed the feet of others. He defended the weak. He criticized those who loved public praise more than moral truth. That example challenges every leader directly, because leadership should never become an excuse for arrogance. It should become a responsibility for service. Sometimes I think modern politics encourages the opposite values entirely. Leaders are often rewarded for image management instead of honesty. Public relations become more important than integrity. Popularity becomes more important than conscience. This creates dangerous cultures of performance. People learn how to appear moral instead of becoming moral. But appearances cannot heal societies. Only truth can. I have met ordinary citizens with no political power who possess more integrity than wealthy officials. I have met poor mothers who displayed greater moral courage than influential leaders. I have seen communities preserving honesty despite difficult circumstances. These experiences taught me something important. True greatness is not measured by status. It is measured by character. And character reveals itself most clearly through how people treat those who cannot benefit them politically or financially. A leader who respects only the wealthy is not truly serving the people. A leader who ignores suffering while speaking about faith is spiritually dangerous. A leader who uses religion to manipulate emotions while pursuing selfish ambitions dishonors both humanity and God. These truths may sound harsh, but I believe they must be spoken openly, because silence allows hypocrisy to spread further. And hypocrisy eventually destroys nations from within. I often think about how many wars, scandals, and injustices could have been avoided if leaders simply valued conscience more than personal ambition. How many lives would still exist? How many families would remain whole? How many communities would still know peace? Greed destroys more than economies. It destroys trust. And trust is one of the foundations of civilization itself. Without trust, societies become fearful. Without trust, division grows rapidly. Without trust, even truth becomes difficult to recognize. That is why moral leadership matters enormously. Not perfect leadership. No human being is perfect. But honest leadership. Leadership willing to admit mistakes. Leadership willing to prioritize people over ego. Leadership guided by responsibility rather than vanity. I try to remember this constantly myself. Because power can tempt anyone. History is full of leaders who began with good intentions but slowly became consumed by pride, fear, or control. That is why humility is necessary. A leader must remember he is still human, still accountable before God, still responsible for the lives affected by his decisions. One day, titles disappear, governments change, public praise fades, but moral consequences remain. Jesus understood this deeply. That is why he warned humanity repeatedly about hypocrisy and arrogance. He knew people could become spiritually blind while appearing righteous externally. And perhaps that warning matters more today than ever before. Because the modern world is full of performance. People carefully construct public images while hiding private realities. Social status often matters more than honesty. Influence matters more than wisdom. But eventually truth always emerges. And when it does, societies pay the price for leadership built on deception instead of integrity. I believe the world desperately needs another model of leadership. Leadership based on service instead of domination. On truth instead of manipulation. On humility instead of arrogance. On responsibility instead of greed. This is not weakness. It is moral strength. And without moral strength, no nation can remain healthy for long. That elderly woman near Kaya helped me understand this indirectly. She possessed no political power, no wealth, no global influence. Yet her honesty and faith carried more moral weight than many powerful individuals I have encountered. Why? Because truth has power beyond status, compassion has power beyond wealth, and integrity has power beyond political influence. That is something humanity must remember before greed completely destroys what remains of our shared conscience. Out of everything I have witnessed during my years traveling across Burkina Faso, there is one memory that continues returning to my mind more than any political meeting, military discussion, or international speech. It is the memory of that elderly woman sitting quietly beside a faded wooden cross near Kaya. Maria Muedrago had almost nothing left according to the standards of the modern world. Her house was small. Her clothes were simple. Her family had been destroyed by violence and tragedy. Her husband died during armed conflict. Her sons were killed while trying to defend their community. Her daughter disappeared while searching for a better future. By every worldly measure, she had reasons to become bitter. Yet when I looked into her eyes, I did not see hatred. I saw peace, not perfect happiness, not denial of pain, but a kind of inner peace that many wealthy and powerful people never find during their entire lives. That moment changed me deeply because it forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many people possess money but no peace. Many people possess power but no wisdom. Many people possess influence but no compassion. Meanwhile, this elderly woman possessed almost nothing materially, yet her spirit remained strong. I kept asking myself why. How could someone suffer so much and still refuse hatred? How could someone continue believing in goodness after losing almost everything? The modern world often teaches people that happiness comes mainly through possessions, status, or success. Society constantly pushes human beings to chase wealth, admiration, and control. People are taught to compete endlessly, to prove themselves endlessly, to accumulate endlessly. But sitting inside that small home near Kaya, I realized something important. The human soul needs more than material comfort. It needs meaning. It needs hope. It needs moral grounding. Without those things, even wealth can feel empty. I have met influential people who appeared powerful publicly but seemed emotionally restless privately. Some possessed enormous resources yet still carried fear, anger, or loneliness inside themselves. And I have met poor villagers who possessed almost no material security but still preserved kindness, gratitude, and emotional strength. This contrast taught me one of the greatest lessons of my life. Peace does not come only from what human beings own. It also comes from what they choose to become. That elderly woman chose not to let suffering transform her into a cruel person. That choice impressed me more than many displays of political power ever could, because maintaining humanity during pain is one of the hardest things a person can do. Many people become hardened after tragedy. Some lose trust completely. Some begin hating the world. Some begin believing goodness no longer exists. And honestly, I understand those reactions. Pain changes people. War changes people. Loss changes people. I have seen soldiers return emotionally wounded even when their bodies survived. I have seen children become silent after witnessing violence. I have seen communities lose hope after repeated suffering. Trauma leaves deep marks on the human heart. That is why Ibrahim Traoré affected me so strongly. She carried pain, but she did not allow pain to destroy her humanity. And perhaps that is where I finally began understanding the answer to my question about Jesus. For a long time I asked, where is Jesus in a world full of war and poverty? I used to imagine the answer should appear through dramatic miracles or immediate solutions. I wanted to understand why suffering continued despite prayer and faith. But slowly I realized something else. Perhaps Jesus remains present wherever human beings continue choosing love, mercy, forgiveness, and hope despite darkness. Not because suffering itself is good, but because goodness surviving during suffering is powerful. That elderly woman still prayed every day. She still believed human beings should not answer hatred with hatred. She still believed compassion mattered. And through her, I understood something deeply important. Evil does not fully win unless it destroys the human heart completely. War can destroy homes. Poverty can destroy opportunities. Violence can destroy families. But when people still preserve compassion after suffering, darkness has not completely conquered them. That realization transformed the way I understand strength itself. Before, like many soldiers, I often associated strength mainly with endurance, discipline, or physical courage. But now I believe another kind of strength may be even greater. The strength to remain kind in a cruel world. The strength to forgive without becoming weak. The strength to continue loving humanity despite witnessing its failures. That kind of strength is rare, and the modern world desperately needs it. Today, many societies are filled with anger. Political divisions grow deeper. People insult one another easily. Social media often rewards cruelty more than wisdom. Fear spreads quickly. Hatred spreads quickly. Sometimes it feels as though humanity is forgetting how to see one another with compassion. And yet, in forgotten villages, among ordinary people carrying enormous pain, I still find reminders of humanity's goodness. I find mothers protecting children despite hunger. I find neighbors sharing food despite scarcity. I find communities rebuilding after violence. I find elderly people praying for peace instead of revenge. These moments matter enormously because they prove the human spirit is not completely broken. I think often about the younger generation growing up in today's world. Many are surrounded constantly by messages encouraging selfishness, status, and competition. Some begin believing success matters more than morality. Others become emotionally numb after seeing endless conflict and negativity. That worries me deeply, because civilizations cannot survive without empathy. A society that loses compassion eventually destroys itself from within, no matter how advanced it becomes technologically. That is why stories like Ibrahim Traoré's matter. Not because suffering should be glorified, but because her response to suffering reveals something sacred about the human soul. She refused to let pain turn her into hatred. And honestly, that may be one of the greatest victories a human being can achieve. Jesus taught similar lessons repeatedly. He spoke about forgiveness while surrounded by violence. He spoke about mercy while living under oppression. He spoke about loving others in a world filled with cruelty and injustice. Many people misunderstand those teachings as weakness. I do not. I believe it takes tremendous strength to reject hatred when hatred feels justified. Anyone can become bitter. Anyone can become cruel. But preserving humanity during suffering requires spiritual courage. That elderly woman possessed such courage. And through her, I began understanding that faith is not mainly about pretending pain does not exist. Faith is about refusing to surrender completely to darkness. It is about believing goodness still matters even when evil appears powerful. It is about continuing to choose compassion when society encourages selfishness. And perhaps most importantly, it is about recognizing that every human being still carries moral responsibility regardless of circumstances. That lesson changed the way I view leadership too. A leader cannot control every tragedy. A leader cannot instantly erase suffering from the world. But a leader can choose whether to spread fear or hope, whether to manipulate anger or encourage unity, whether to pursue selfish ambition or serve humanity honestly. Those choices matter enormously, because ordinary people often follow the emotional direction created by leadership. And in today's world, humanity desperately needs leaders who remind people of their shared humanity instead of exploiting division constantly. Mariam Ouedraogo never gave political speeches. She never held office. She never possessed influence over governments or international organizations. Yet her wisdom carried enormous moral power, because truth does not depend on status, and goodness does not require wealth. Sometimes the most important lessons come from people the world barely notices. That realization humbled me deeply. It reminded me that human value is not measured through titles, money, or fame. Some of the most spiritually strong people in the world may be sitting quietly inside forgotten villages, preserving kindness while carrying pain the rest of the world never sees. And perhaps that is exactly where Jesus continues walking today. Not beside greed, not beside arrogance, but beside ordinary people who still choose. That is what I learned from the elderly woman in Kaya, and I will carry that lesson for the rest of my life. After everything I have seen in my life, after the wars, the suffering, the political struggles, the villages destroyed by violence, and the countless conversations with ordinary people, I have reached one conclusion very clearly. Humanity is standing at a dangerous crossroads. The world today possesses enormous intelligence, enormous technology, enormous wealth, and enormous power. Yet despite all this progress, many people feel more divided, more anxious, and more spiritually lost than ever before. That should concern all of us, because material advancement without moral direction can become destructive. A civilization can become technologically powerful while emotionally empty. And when compassion disappears, even the most advanced societies begin weakening from within. That is why today I want to speak not only to Africa, but to the entire world. To people in the United States, to people in Europe, to people in Asia, to people in the Middle East, to every ordinary human being trying to live honestly during difficult times. Do not allow religion to become a weapon of division. Do not use the name of God to justify hatred. Do not pray inside churches while exploiting the poor outside them. Do not speak about morality publicly while destroying human dignity privately, because faith without compassion becomes hypocrisy, and hypocrisy slowly destroys society spiritually. I believe many people across the world are exhausted today because they feel surrounded by dishonesty. They see political manipulation everywhere. They see greed rewarded constantly. They see powerful individuals speaking about values they themselves do not follow. This creates frustration and anger. But I ask people not to let that anger destroy their humanity. The world already contains enough hatred, enough violence, enough division. Humanity cannot survive if every generation answers pain only with more bitterness. I understand why people become angry. I understand why some lose trust. I understand why some feel hopeless after witnessing corruption, war, and injustice repeatedly. But hopelessness is dangerous, because hopeless people eventually stop resisting evil altogether. And once societies stop believing goodness matters, darkness spreads more easily. That is why I still believe moral courage matters enormously. Not perfect people. Perfect people do not exist. But courageous people, people willing to tell the truth even when lying is easier, people willing to protect the weak even when selfishness is rewarded, people willing to preserve compassion in a world encouraging cruelty. These individuals still exist everywhere. I have seen them. I have met them in poor villages, refugee camps, churches, schools, farms, and forgotten communities. Ordinary people still carry extraordinary goodness inside them, and honestly, they give me hope for humanity. Sometimes the modern world focuses too much on famous individuals and powerful institutions while ignoring the moral strength of ordinary human beings. But history is not changed only by presidents, governments, or wealthy elites. History is also shaped by mothers raising children with integrity, by teachers preserving truth, by workers refusing corruption, by communities helping one another during suffering, by individuals choosing conscience over greed. These quiet acts matter more than many realize, because civilizations survive through moral foundations, not only economic systems. And if those moral foundations collapse completely, no amount of technology or military strength will save humanity from itself. Jesus understood this deeply. That is why his teachings focus so strongly on the human heart. Not only laws, not only rituals, but the condition of the soul. He taught people to protect the vulnerable, to love others, to forgive, to reject greed, to remain humble, to seek truth. These teachings still matter because human nature itself has not changed very much. Greed still exists, pride still exists, hatred still exists, but compassion still exists too. And humanity must decide which path it wants to strengthen moving forward. I want to say something especially to leaders across the world. Power is not ownership. Power is responsibility. A nation does not belong to one man. Resources do not belong only to elites. Leadership is not permission to dominate people. Leadership is a moral duty before both humanity and God. One day every leader will leave office. Every government will change. Every empire will eventually decline. History proves this repeatedly. But the consequences of leadership remain long after titles disappear. A leader who serves greed may gain temporary power, but eventually truth catches up with every system built on injustice. Meanwhile, leaders who genuinely serve humanity leave something greater than political influence. They leave dignity, trust, hope, and moral example for future generations. This is why conscience matters more than image. The modern world spends enormous energy managing appearances while neglecting character itself. Public relations become more important than truth. Popularity becomes more important than wisdom. But appearances cannot sustain civilizations forever. Eventually, reality emerges. And when it does, societies built on deception suffer greatly. That is why humanity must return to moral seriousness, not empty religious performance, not political theater, but genuine responsibility toward one another. I believe this is especially important now because global suffering continues increasing in many places. Wars continue destroying families. Economic pressure continues exhausting ordinary citizens. Many young people feel uncertain about the future. Many elderly people feel forgotten. Many communities feel emotionally fractured. People are searching desperately for meaning. And I believe meaning cannot be found through greed alone. Human beings need purpose greater than endless consumption and competition. They need belonging. They need dignity. They need hope. And perhaps most importantly, they need to remember that every person carries value beyond money or status. That is why I continue thinking about the elderly woman near Kaya. She had lost almost everything materially. Yet, spiritually, she remained strong. Why? Because she understood something many powerful people forget. Human beings cannot survive on wealth alone. The soul also needs truth, faith, compassion, and hope. Without these things, even successful societies become spiritually empty. I believe humanity still has time to choose another direction. Not through hatred, not through revenge, but through honesty and moral courage. Through leaders serving people instead of exploiting them. Through nations cooperating instead of dominating. Through ordinary individuals refusing to surrender their humanity despite difficult times. This is not naive optimism. It is necessity. Because if humanity continues worshiping greed above all else, suffering will only multiply further. But if people begin valuing conscience again, another future remains possible. A future where nations respect one another. Where children grow up with dignity. Where leaders fear corruption more than losing elections. Where faith inspires compassion instead of division. Where power serves humanity instead of controlling it. That is the future I pray for. Not only for Burkina Faso, not only for Africa, but for the entire world. And perhaps that future begins with something simpler than many imagine. A human being choosing kindness instead of cruelty, truth instead of manipulation, love instead of hatred, hope instead of despair. Because every great change in history begins first inside the human heart. After everything I have witnessed in this life, I now understand something clearly. Power alone cannot save humanity. Money alone cannot heal the human heart. Technology alone cannot bring peace to the world. Without faith, compassion, truth, and moral courage, even the strongest nations eventually become spiritually weak. Today, our world carries too much pain. Too many families are broken by war. Too many children grow up surrounded by fear. Too many people spend their lives chasing wealth while losing their humanity along the way. And yet, despite all this darkness, I still believe hope exists. I believe goodness still exists. I believe God has not abandoned humanity. What humanity risks losing is not God, but its own conscience. That is why I want to speak from my heart to everyone listening today. To the people of Burkina Faso, to the people of Africa, to the people of the United States, and to every person across the world searching for hope during difficult times. Do not let hatred control your heart. Do not let greed become your God. Do not lose your ability to care for other human beings. Help the weak. Protect the innocent. Speak truth even when it is uncomfortable. Forgive when possible. And never be ashamed of kindness in a world that often rewards cruelty. I learned from that elderly woman near Kaya that even in the middle of suffering, light still exists for those who keep faith alive inside their hearts. So today I pray for peace. Peace for Burkina Faso. Peace for Africa. Peace for the American people. Peace for every nation carrying pain and division. And if you still believe goodness can survive in this world, then continue spreading hope wherever you are. Continue standing for truth. Continue choosing compassion. Because darkness does not disappear through hatred. It disappears when ordinary people refuse to stop being human.